Good morning, fifth grade. Today we're going to finish up the wonderful text, Okie Go Home, and learn about how the Great Depression affected people living in Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl. Before we get started, I want you to complete this quick write in part 1 of your notes. Describe that, this should say, describe what life was like. You can go ahead and fix this in your text. For farmers during the Great Depression. So based on our gallery walk, based on what you've already read, what was life like for farmers during the Great Depression? Please write 3 to 4 excellent sentences. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready to get started. Our focus questions for today are what factors contributed to the Dust Bowl and why did Okies move to California? Was this a good decision? Why or why not? We're going to answer part A during Educanon and part B during the whole group lesson. Before we get started, there are 3 very important words you need to know. The first one is drought. That's when an area doesn't get a lot of rainfall, and this is what happens to the land. It becomes dry and crusty. The second word is reservoir. That is a natural lake. It can also be artificial, but it's basically like a lake in the middle of land. And the third one is parched. That's when something's dried out or you're extremely thirsty. So parched could actually be a definition for this person and this land. You could also say is parched because of the drought. All right, we're going to start reading paragraphs 15 through 16. So if you turn in your text, that's to page 6. We're actually going to read 14, 15, and 16 today. Okay, as we're reading, we want to make sure we're collecting evidence. So the first piece of evidence we need to collect is what obstacles did farmers face in the Midwest? What obstacles did farmers face in the Midwest? Let's begin reading at the top of page 6. Throughout the 1930s, tens of thousands of dispossessed tenants and sharecroppers were evicted from their homes. Remember, those are the tenants and the sharecroppers. Those are the people that farmed the land. And they were evicted or they were kicked off of their farms. They joined the nation's drifting population of migrant farm workers. Some 4 million men, women, and children who harvested crops on commercial farms from Maine to California. So instead of staying in one place and having their own farm, many of these farmers in the Midwest became migrant farm workers where they moved from farm to farm. So they didn't have their own farms anymore. Instead, they moved from farm to farm, trying to get work. All right, paragraph 15, we want to know the obstacles. Get ready to underline. Meanwhile, as if the nation's economic crisis weren't bad enough, nature dealt a crippling blow to farmers in the nation's heartland. That's another way of saying, wow, as if life wasn't hard enough, farmers experienced even more obstacles. Let's keep reading to figure out what the obstacles are. One of the worst droughts in memory gripped the Great Plains from North Dakota to Texas. Underline that and put a number 1 out beside it. The first obstacle was a drought. Let's keep reading. Along with the lowest rainfall ever recorded in the region, a succession of blistering heat waves baked the plains. Underline that, a succession of blistering heat waves baked the plains. Put a number 2 out beside it. Not only was there a drought, which meant no rain, but then there were also heat waves on top of that. Let's keep going. What happened because of the heat waves? Ponds, streams, and reservoirs dried up. Underline that. Put a number 3 out beside it. Crops withered in the fields. Underline that. Put a number 4 out beside it. In some places, staggering livestock, weak and wild-eyed from hunger, bawling helplessly for water, dropped dead in their tracks. Underline, livestock dropped dead in their tracks. Put a number 5 out beside it. Wow, there are 5 obstacles that farmers face. Let's make sure we can name them in our answer for number 1. Farmers face drought, heat waves, dried up ponds, streams, and reservoirs, withering crops, and their livestock drop dead. It's pretty hard to be successful as a farmer when you don't have any crops or any animals. We're going to read the next paragraph, and we're going to look for evidence that says what factors contributed to the Dust Bowl in the Midwest. Yep, let's keep reading the next paragraph. There are even more factors that contributed to this area being called the Dust Bowl. Bottom of page 6. Poor farming practices and overgrazing by cattle and sheep had exhausted much of the region's topsoil. Underline that. Topsoil is that first layer of dirt. You need that for farming. Oftentimes topsoil has a lot of nutrients. And because the farmers weren't farming the right way, and because the cattle were eating too much grass in one place, the topsoil didn't have any more nutrients. As a result, here we go. The 1930s drought was unusually destructive. That's the second factor. So if the farmers had done a good job farming, and if they hadn't put their cattle in one spot too long to eat up all the grass, the drought wouldn't have been as bad. It wouldn't have had the same effect. But because the farmers weren't farming the right way, and because they were leaving their cattle too long in one place to eat up the grass, the drought was worse. Let's keep reading. Prairie winds swept down on this loose, dry soil, scooped it up, and carried it into the air as enormous choking clouds of dust. So, because the topsoil was so dry, because these poor farming practices, and because the cattle were eating in place too long, when the winds came, the topsoil just blew away. And it all blew up into the air, and started to create these dust storms. Let's keep reading. The author describes the dust storms. Terrifying wind-driven dust storms called black blizzards boiled up from the parched land and rolled across entire states, darkening the sky, advancing at 50 miles an hour, as thousands of fleeing geese, ducks, and smaller birds raced for their lives ahead of the approaching storm. That's really interesting. Zoom in on the part where it says rolled across entire states. So these dust storms were pretty serious. And the longer they lasted, the more dust they were able to blow up. And they just got stronger and stronger as they rolled across the states. So let's go back to our question that says, what factors contributed to the Dust Bowls in the Midwest? Well, we know poor farming practices and overgrazing of cattle exhausted the topsoil. So much so that the wind was able to scoop it up and form these enormous clouds of dust that choked people. And it even had the geese, ducks, and birds flying for their lives. Press pause to write down your answer in number 2 and play when you're ready for 3 and 4. All right, number 3 is a figurative language question. Let's zoom in on this quote. Terrifying wind-driven dust storms called black blizzards boiled up from the parched land and rolled across entire states, darkening the sky. It asks you to underline the figurative language. I'm looking at the part that says boiled up from the parched land. Storms can't actually, they don't like boil up. That's a type of figurative language. It's describing how the black blizzards come to be. They boil up from the land. And then it asks you, also black blizzards is a form, it's also a form of figurative language because it's alliteration. It repeats the first sound. Black, that's the B sound, and blizzards, B. So we have black blizzards, which is alliteration, and then we have boiled up from the parched land. All right. Next, we have, how does this use of figurative language help you better understand the Dust Bowl? Well, it says that the Dust Bowl was a terrifying place to live. If you saw a black blizzard rolling across an entire state, this lets you know that they were probably pretty deadly, and it was really scary to experience a dust storm. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready to get started on number 4. According to the text, what effect might the black blizzard have on birds living in the area? Well, if we go back in our text, it says they had to fly for their lives. So that lets me know if they weren't quick enough, they probably died because they choked from all the dust that was in the air. And 4B. Using the information in the text about dust storms, how might a large dust storm affect the people working in the fields? Why do you think this? This question is especially important for the novel we're about to read called Esperanza Rising. So if you are in the field and this large dust storm, which means the air is thick with dust, very thick with dust, how might that affect you as a farm worker? Silently write down your answer, and then you have plenty of time to write this paragraph. What factors contributed to the Dust Bowl? I can use evidence from questions 1 and question 2 to write down my answer.